Good afternoon and Happy New Year. Welcome to our special episode. Special guest, Bob Seggerson. Again, this is Frank Kill with Coach Matt Tabler. Special episode this week because of the legendary coach, Bob Seggerson, is in the house. And what a great week to start off high school boys basketball, as this is the incoming week with Delphus St. John's and LCC game. It is one of those long-time running games that, Seg was part of. But, we thought this was a special episode because to have you on, you are a legendary Hall of Famer, someone who did a great big favor for me 20-some-odd years ago by taking me under your wing. But glad to have you, Coach Seg.
Well, happy to be here. Former player, former assistant coach who took my place and has done such a great job. And you two have done a great job with this podcast. A lot of people talking about it.
Well, just let me give you a few accomplishments here in Seg's career. I actually had an opportunity to play for Coach Seggerson, and obviously molded me into what I wanted to be when I grew up, is to be a head basketball coach. He graduated from LCC in 1966. He played basketball and graduated from St. Joseph College of Indiana in 1970. In 1985, he earned a master's degree in guidance education from the University of Dayton. Seg's career record was 518. 518, Frank. Can you believe 518?
I'm not sure you and I have that combined, but again, I think I was a part of maybe 200 of those wins in a matter of 2 years, 3 years, but those were some amazing years.
Yeah, 71, and so he was 518 and 209, Bob, with a 71% winning percentage. He made 6 Final Fours, including 2 state runners-up in 89 and 94, and a state championship in 2010. State of Ohio Coach of the Year twice. He won 20 sectional championships, 9 district championships, 6 regional championships. I mean, a coach going into coaching couldn't even dream of what Coach Seggerson's career was. And Coach Seggerson, as you look at your entire embodied career as a head coach, does it seem surreal from when you first started back in 1978?
Yeah, it does, Matt. I was just thinking as you were running those numbers off, I remember the first year I became the head coach of Lima Central Catholic in the 1978-79 season. And I was just trying to get through that first year. And the fact that we went over 500 was a big thrill because I don't think anybody expected it. So I just remember the early years trying to build the program and get some interest and get the younger kids more excited about the game, that type of stuff. So I could never have imagined the career path I took.
Well, you definitely have changed the expectations of Lima Central Catholic, because just getting over 500, that is no more thought of anymore. Like the Birds want to win 17, 18 games and expect to go to a state Final Four, but that's all because of you and the standards you set.
Well, not really. I think even before me, we had some great basketball teams, and I learned under some really great coaches. Joe Gottfried, who ended up as a Division I college coach and athletic director for many years. Bob Fisher, who went on to Swanton and had a great career. And then my great friend Jimmy Carter, who stepped down early. And when I took the job, I tried to talk him into keeping it at the time. But he became part of the program. He stayed in the program and helped me. And he was a big part of my success, especially early.
Can you imagine that today, a coach stepping down and then coming on your coaching staff a few years later? It's not heard of, because a lot of people in today's world have that stigma, like, well, he's a head coach forever, he can never be an assistant. But you see a lot of good programs right now with Shawnee, with Nick Berkey, who is a head coach. Granted, he's coaching his kids, but isn't it always such a special thing to have another head coach out there?
Oh, yeah. I think, anytime that happens, I think of Ottawa Glandar with their head coach, Tyson, and his dad sitting on the bench with him. And back in the day, his father was the head coach at Miller City, and I went head-to-head with him many times. And I'll tell you something, that guy can coach. I mean, we always went in with more talent, and it was a battle. Every game we ever played with him, I always had enormous respect for him. And when I saw him on the bench with Tyson, I thought that's a pretty nice combination you're going against.
Well,
Well, I got a quick story I want to tell. When we were playing over at Miller City one year, and it was our undefeated season until the last game of the year is my junior year, and I had to cover the Lammers kid, and he was a corner three-pointer shooter, and I left him alone 3 straight times, Coach Seg. And there was a foul, and you brought me over to the sideline. And I won't repeat exactly what you said, but it was, if you let this guy ruin our undefeated season, I'm going to kick your butt. And then what you finished at classic Seg, you gave me a butt tap and said, let's go. I walk in, they shoot the first free throw, I get subbed out.
Well, Seg, that being that we're on, this is not on the script, but your thoughts right now, seeing an Ottawa Glandorf team that's 1-7, obviously, what'd you say there? That's 2-7. My apologies. But to see them, I was at their game last week against LCC. What can you tell me about your history of OG? Because obviously the crowd was always so packed before the JV game. I always remember you telling me, hey, you tell your parents to get here by the halftime of the JV game because it's going to be a full house. Right. It's nowadays you can walk in that gym and find any seat that you want. What are your biggest memories against OG and then, again, the rivalry that LCC had with them?
Well, my biggest memory is the very first time I coached against them as a head coach. It was the second game of my career. The first game was a Friday night overtime game at Van Wert, where a very good player missed 2 free throws after the game, and we won by 1 point. I remember driving home in a bus and thinking, hey, this isn't too bad. And the next night we had to go to OG. Ron Niekamp is their coach. He puts on a 1-3, 1/2 court trap, 1-3, 1. I had no idea what to do with it. We hadn't practiced it. Here I was pretty cocky. And we didn't score 30 points that night, I think. I think we had like 30. And I remember driving home on the bus and thinking, this isn't going to be so easy. And so I got to coach against him, and then Dave Sweet for many years, and he was a great coach. But I liked going to Ottawa Glandorf. We did okay up there, but I liked that crowd because as rabid as they were, I always felt like they appreciated a good game.
Yep.
And so that, especially those people that sat around me, behind me, because you get to know them after you coach for 30 years because they got the same people in the same seats, and it's like Delphus. But I got to actually like going up there. I didn't like losing up there. And I think it's one of the toughest places for an official to call a game. But I have fond memories of those. And I came good friends with the coaches that coached up there, even though we were kind of battling each other quite a bit.
Well, you're listening to the Varsity Locker Room Podcast. Your host, Frank Kill, with Matt Tabler, and our special guest, Bob Seggerson. Again, this episode is to kind of talk about the history of Lima Central Catholic and Delphus St. John's. This Sunday, January the 12th, will be a big matchup in the Vatican. You just talked about going to Ottawa. Seg, I've heard a lot of your stories about going over to Delphus St. John's, and one of our podcast moments was buying a 50-50 ticket one time, and you always told your assistants and guys that were scouting to buy a 50-50. You won the 50-50 at Delphus St. John's once.
I won the 50-50 on a Friday night, and I forget how much it was. It was nice little cash. And then that Saturday morning, I was on a radio show that they used to have at a restaurant in downtown Delphus, and they had a trivia question, and nobody could get the trivia question. Well, I got it. I forget what it was. It was a Cleveland Browns trivia question. I had it, so I won like a free dinner. And then that next day, we went over on a Sunday, and we won at the Vatican. So I was 3 for 3 that weekend. And then I went like 0 for 50 or something.
Well, actually, your career record is 16-18 versus Delphus St. John's, but it was on January 10th of 2010 you earned your 500th victory against Delphus St. John's. So that kind of was probably bittersweet for you on that one.
Yeah, as a coach, the game that sticks in your craw is the last one you coached. Okay, so my last year I coached. The last time I faced Delphus St. John's, we won. The last time I faced Ottawa, we won. And the last time I faced senior high, we won. So those were the 3 ones that you tick off. So that sticks in my mind to this day, even though we didn't have great records against any of those schools. We won the last one. So that's what sticks in my craw.
Also, don't forget your last game you ever won, too, was a state championship. Did you know going into that season that was going to be your last season? Yeah. And how many people did you tell if you did know that?
Well, I did know it. I knew it in the springtime. I talked about it with Janie, and I talked about it with our principal and athletic director. And so I knew what I was going to do. I think it got out a little bit, so people were talking about it. But a lot of people think, I think they thought I got the idea after the game, I was going to do it. But I knew for a long time. And the people in the administration at LCC knew it too. They knew it before the season started. And I had made the promise to myself and to Janie, my wife, that I was going to enjoy every minute of the season. And I remember early on when we were under 500 around Christmas time, went up and got beat at Liberty Benton to go way under 500, telling Janie, I don't care. I'm going to enjoy this season. I'm going to enjoy these guys. I want to give them the best I can. I had no idea what was coming, but I went into it with a really great attitude.
Well, I still remember telling, Tabes, we were 2-4 leaving Findlay. And I said, well, I don't think we're going to lose another game. And, of course, as an assistant coach, you're like, it's house money for me, but that's just the way I felt. But I also felt that was the way that you were kind of coaching. You were coaching as this was your last go round. And again, I never told anybody. I know you, the inner circle of your coaches, we all kind of knew. And, you go, I remember in the sectional tournament against St. Henry, great, Steve Trout's here. This is going to be my last game because I never win against Steve Trout. Yeah. It's almost like a victory, as you said, between St. John's and OG and Lima Senior. You beat Steve Trout too. Yeah. Well, but those were the good memories that you can kind of talk about at the end of the year.
Well, a couple of years, the year before especially, I was talking about getting out of it. And I remember I went over to Crestview and we played a game. And after the game, Ray Etzler was there, who was not coaching at the time, but he was a fan. He was in the stands. He came down to me. He said, hey, I hear you're going to step down at the end of this year. This was the year before. I said, well, I'm thinking about it. And he said, don't. Now, he had stepped down a little early. I mean, he really got into me a little bit. He says, I can see the passion you have for this game. He said, don't do that. You're going to make a mistake. And that hit me. And then later on, Al Welch had heard it, and he called me. And Al Welch and I were good buddies. He was a competitor. And he saw that I was close to 500. And that was his thing. He said, you can't. What are you going to go out at 499 or 498? Because that's what it would have been, something like that. Mm-hmm. And so he was an influence on why I didn't quit a year earlier. And I think God's hand had a role in that too, because if I had gotten out, I wouldn't have got the cherry on top of the cake,
Well, speaking about the cherries on top, Seg, we talked about philosophies of coaching again, from the late 70s to the early 2000s, to 2010. I mean, obviously the game had evolved. You went from, 3-pointers to where it's at now. I mean, I know you always talked about, when I was coaching, it's like, man, I'm glad I got out when I did. But how do you feel? I mean, you still watch a lot of basketball. How do you feel like the game or the philosophy of coaching is now versus what it was way back then?
I think the coaching philosophy has changed as the athletes have changed, because there's more training now. They're training earlier. They're ready to play at a higher level earlier. I mean, I never played. I mean, I think in 32 years I played 2 freshmen. Well, now their kids come into high school, they're ready to play, and the athletes are stronger, they're faster, and they can shoot it better because of the gun and because they get these training coaches and they're in a gym for 1,000. I know a kid who took 80,000 shots this summer, and so that spread the floor. You get 3 more points. So the game philosophy has kind of followed, I think, the transition that's gone on with the athletes themselves. But it is a different game. I can tell you this, they're not running Marquette anymore. And I got away from it the last 5 or 6 years. But it's a different game. I still enjoy watching the game. I really do. It's frustrating sometimes when I see a kid, not take the layup, instead dribbles out to 3 and misses a 3. That just drives me nuts. But the game's evolved. I mean, Tom Williams, our good friend, who was on my staff for many years, played in the 40s and Ohio State in the 50s. They were shooting free throws underhanded. And he saw the first guy shoot a jump shot. Kid from Indiana, he told me about it. It was a player from Indiana who shot a natural jump shot that nobody had ever seen before. Within 10 years, every 10-year-old kid's out there shooting jump shots. So the game evolves, and it's still evolving, and it might look a lot different, who knows, 50 years from now.
Well, just talking about that, and you're talking about the athletes and how they've evolved and how much more time they put into it. We're not going to put you on the spot with your players, just in case you would forget a few along the way. Yeah. Not me, but real players in LCC's history. But who were some of the toughest players that you coached against coming up in your entire career?
Oh boy, that's a really good question. I really can't even begin to tell you. Jamar Butler was he was very, very hard to guard. We didn't guard Simpson, but I saw him play at our open gyms all the time. He was fun to watch. Ottawa had some great players. A lot of these players didn't go on to play great college careers, but they're great high school players. I loved watching Dakota Mathias play. I thought he was among the best players around here to not be Mr. Ohio, Mr. Basketball. And
there was one I know that played against you your last year coaching. They just said he was an unbelievable defender. Was the kid from Liberty Benton, Aaron Kraft. I heard he was a heck of a player. And when you coach for 32 years, it's easy to forget all these guys because there's probably so many great players that you got to coach against.
Yeah. I'll drive home when we're done here, and then 10 names will pop into my head. But Dakota was Kraft was a terrific player, and he was a solid offensive player. But you're right, he was the best defender that we ever played against. He could pick your pocket, and you'd be 3 false dribbles down the floor and wouldn't even know it.
Yeah,
he was that slick.
And then you're speaking of coaches, you brought up Coach Sweet, and you brought up Coach Etzler, and you brought up Coach Welch. Who were some other tough coaches that were hard to prepare for just because they always had their ball clubs ready?
The best coaches I ever coached against I put Bob Arnzen at the top always, but then I quickly follow up with Joe Petroselli at Kettering Alder, who stopped playing us once we beat him. And because he said he couldn't afford to lose to LCC, but we found a way to beat them. And Ron Hagemeyer, who was just a great high school basketball coach, I always appreciated him. Dave Sweet, Al Welch, the Krause brothers, the coach at Orville, or the coach that beat us at State
Perry Reese,
who I got to know a little bit after that. I always appreciated him, and just a lot of terrific coaches. Too many to mention, and there's still some great coaches around. I mean, they go underappreciated a lot.
Well, definitely, and again, you learn so much from other coaches, and I have always known that. You and Petro, I loved your relationship even just a couple years ago down at the state tournament, seeing you two talk, and you know what, you're miles away, but it's like your friendship never, the friendship is still close. And I think that's what I miss. And I know Tabes and we talk about being out of coaching. We love that bond that we had, that fraternity of coaches.
Yeah. Well, the good ones are also usually good people. I didn't mention Ray Etzler, and I should have, and you guys should remember this. Ray Etzler and I went head to head like maybe 8-10 times. I think I won every one of them. But I'm telling you, at least half of those, he coached my tail off, because we just had better players. And I was constantly stealing plays from him. And so I had a play named Ray. I had a play named Etzler. I had a play named C. I had all these different names of these, and I was giving him credit for it. And he would just laugh because I'd be running them against him all the time. But he was a terrific coach. I wish he would have stayed in it a little longer.
And we beat them in the regional one year. Yeah. And David Kowicki, who's a good friend of mine over in the Crestview area, he still claims they had more Catholics on the floor than we did at the end of the game.
Yeah, that was a common refrain.
Well, I was at the Crestview LCC game, when Dwight hits the game winner, in the snowstorm. When I think of, I was supposed to have a game tonight that gets canceled, and the roads are bad, but they're not that bad. But that night you guys traveled from Lima to Convoy. Yeah. And I remember, kind of the quote was that you would have taken dog sleds over to Convoy to play that game.
Well, I said that because from the first time we played them, it went double overtime at senior high on a Tuesday night, which should have been canceled. But Ray brought that team over, and we went into double overtime, and Travis Mary hit a shot from like 3 foot, beyond 3 foot, to win that game. And it set a precedent that there were a lot of close games, and we were winning them. We were winning these close games. But he was coming over when the snow was bad, and I always promised myself if we ever got a bad night that I was going to take him over. And that night, remember, we actually had to stop the bus in Delphus and call him and make sure the game, because they had like a plow in front of us to get us over there. And it was a great game. But then Dwight comes up with another miracle. And sometimes you get into a rut where that happens with an opponent. You just can't find a way to beat them. And Bob Arnzen used to tell me his theory was if somebody beats you 3 times in a row, get them off your schedule. and because he said at that point, it becomes a psychological barrier. And, I think we ran into that with several teams, and we weren't in the league for 90% of the time, so we couldn't afford to drop opponents. We were always looking for good
Right.
opponents.
Well, you talk about tough opponents, and again, it was in 2002, 2003, you got your home court, and you had a lot of, input on what you wanted in terms of a home court. But let's talk about some toughest venues. And again, I know venues, it has evolved, and gymnasiums have gotten bigger, floors have gotten longer. What are some of your top tier, venues that you coached in, obviously not playing, but what you've coached in, and why they were so impactful?
Well, I mean, obviously I got to bring up the Vatican and Delta St. John's first, because it's a tough place to win. I've often said, if you're going to beat Delta St. John's, you got to win by double figures. You can't go into the fourth quarter up 6 or 7 points. You're not going to win that game. And so that's a tough place to play. Ottawa was a tough place to play. I think obviously Kettering-Alder was the toughest place we had to play. We beat them in 1969 before I was coaching, and they didn't lose another home game for like 26 years, including about 3 or 4 times when I took teams down there. That was a really tough place to play, and Elida Fieldhouse comes to mind. We had to play there often twice a year. We'd play Elida, and then you play in the tournament. And it was a tough place to play because of the acoustics, I think. It could get really loud in there. And plus, you were always playing a really good team because you were playing Elida, and they were normally really good, especially when Chris Adams is coaching. And or it's a tournament game, like a district tournament game, and that's going to be a tough game. So it's tough to play because it was loud, but I still to this day love walking into Elida Fieldhouse. And I'd like to think that the old Lima Senior High gym was also a tough place for people to come and play us. It was just a unique style. In fact, when we built our new gym, a lot of people don't realize this. When they asked me what I wanted in a gym, I said, I want one just like senior high. I want bleachers under both baskets. I want a balcony at the east end, and I told them I wanted to come in to the gym through the middle.
They couldn't get that done.
Break in the bit, and they said, "Well, we can't do that," but they gave me everything else. So it's a modern look of the old Lima Senior High gymnasium.
Well, we did a game at Toledo Whitmer, and I don't know if you've ever been in that gym, but it kind of resembles the old Lima because it had the windows on one side, not nearly the size without the bleachers behind. But when I walked in, just walking up to the balcony where you go up a flight of stairs, turn a corner, go up another flight of stairs, I felt like I was in Lima Senior at that point.
A lot of gyms were built in that era, in the 50s, were like that. That was another feature that made the Delta St. John's LCC Sunday game so interesting at senior high, is because whatever team was going to the west had to look up at those windows, and if the game lasted, the varsity usually got on the floor by 2, but if there was an overtime or 2 in the JV game, or if the varsity game went longer, that sun would start to set, and there was no curtains up there. So,
and obviously the guests were going that way at the end of the game.
Except when Arnzen was coaching, he was smart enough to turn it around. So we're going to warm up down there.
Well, talking about that rivalry, we just thought this would be a good time to bring you in. A little research. Delta St. John's leads the series 51-44. But here's the most probably unbelievable stat. In all those games, Delta St. John's has scored 5,700 points. LCC has scored 5,672 points. There's a 28-point difference.
All these games, most of the games are usually pretty close. And it's been that way a long time. And remember, too, that the rivalry with Delphus and LCC goes beyond LCC, especially with St. Rose High School, which was a pre-runner to Lima Central Catholic High School. And they had serious battles. Those Sunday afternoon games in the 30s and 40s and 50s, that was serious business. In fact, I'll give you a little history here. In 1948, when St. Rose was in the state championship final game, St. John's was really the favored team that year. Everybody thought St. John was going to win state that year. They played 3 times, and LCC won all 3. And then in 1949, St. John's was expected to be down. LCC played St. John's 4 times.
Oh, my.
4 times. They played twice during the year. LCC beat them in the sectional final. And in those years, if you made it to the sectional final, you also went on to the district. So you could lose the sectional final, but you were still in the tournament.
So they take the top 2 teams advance.
And they advanced to the district. And this is when there was only 2 divisions. And so that year they met again in the district final, and St. John's finally beat them and went on to win the state championship. It was the only time, I think, in Ohio high school history where a team lost a tournament game and still won the state title.
That's crazy that you could think about that these days.
They played 7 times in 2 years.
Well, doing the research, I noticed that for the longest time they played twice a year.
Yes.
And when you were in high school, you were 6-2 versus Delphus St. John's. Now, I don't know if freshmen played back when you played.
No,
if you played as a freshman.
No, I played as a sophomore, and that was very unusual in that day and age. You rarely saw a sophomore on varsity, and I played a little bit in that game. I remember getting the ball, and I was pressed by the Carter twins, and Coach Lane got me out of that game as fast as he could because I had no idea what I was doing. Everywhere I looked, there was a Carter, and so my initiation as a player was the Carter twins and the Barber, who was on that team, and it was a great team, one of the best Delphus teams ever.
Well, would you ever imagine that Coach Arnzen was the coach coaching against you, that you guys would build up a friendship and a rivalry that you did through all the years that you coached?
Yeah, he was a good man, and he was one of those guys that you could call him and ask him a question, or he would help you in any way he could. He did that with everybody.
Well, I think that was just kind of Coach Arnzen's like personality. Like he loved helping people out, hearing his eulogy during his funeral, talking about people and how he would go to parks, kind of reminded me of like Coach Seggerson going to parks and talking to kids and helping kids. That's just the personality that you two had. But I also think that was the great bond that you two had. Now, obviously over the years with coaching, you coached against Coach Arnzen, then Coach Reindl. And then comes along Coach Norris, who you had probably coached against in terms as a player, and then he becomes the Delphus St. John's coach. What do you remember about those days with Coach Norris?
Well, what I remember was that we talked about the first time LCC played against Crestview.
Mm-hmm.
He was a senior on that team, and he made a 3 at the end of that game to put it into overtime. They had like 3 seconds on the clock, and that's what drew up this play. That was the first play I stole from him, by the way. And I remember that, and he was a great player. And he was young when he started coaching, but he was good. It was one of those things where he won the first couple of times we played against him, and then we had trouble beating him. It was that psychological thing. But we found our way through that.
You weren't allowed to drop them. You weren't allowed to drop them, were you?
No. I'd have dropped him in a heartbeat. But no, I would name him as one of the best coaches I ever coached against too. And he's still doing a great job down in the Columbus area.
It's funny because he coached Aaron Elwer, who Aaron reminds me a lot of Brett. And then I see Aaron's kids, and his kids remind me a lot of Brett's kids. Right. And so there's a lot of similarities. So you think about Brett Norris and what he did to that program, winning the state title between Reindl and Etkin. And then you have Aaron now. And Aaron comes in as this young kid, in the late 2000, I think it was 2008, coming back to Delphus, being a graduate. And again, I remember that first year. And again, we won't need to talk a little bit about the paper slip that there was. Again, we're on a podcast, so everybody likes a little bit of drama. I still remember going, what is this? But again, this was a young Aaron Elwer, and who, obviously comes in talking about bulletin board material. As coaches, we say certain things because we have respect. I had the bulletin board material with the, you dealt with 9s and 10s, and I lose to a team with 9s and 10s. That's not really what I meant. It's just the hand that you were dealt. As coaches, how did you looked at some of the memorable games of Delphus St. John's. You got your 500 win. That was huge. I swear it's like God's hand was in on that. But what are some other memorable games that you can remember, Sega, over your career, whether it's at Delphus, tournament time, or let alone at home?
Well, I remember, I think it was one of Brett's last years. We were not favored in either game. We beat him in the regular season. Then we drew him again in the tournament. I think it was a district semifinal game, and we beat him at home. We beat him at Elida Fieldhouse. And that was nice, because that kind of changed directions in many ways for us. But I have so many memories of Delphus. I remember as a kid waiting to get into Lima Senior High on a Sunday afternoon. And a long line that stretched out the steps leading up to the gym back into the parking lot. We were in there, and the Delphus St. John's bus pulled up. And everybody was like, chanting and stuff. And now off walks all these players right through the crowd, up the steps into the gym. But I remember when Arnzen got off the bus, the crowd quieted, and it almost parted ways for him. And I remember even as a young kid looking up and going, this guy must be pretty special. Everybody shut up, you know. And so that was my first vision of Bob. I saw him differently over the years, you know, as I started playing against him and then coaching against him. But I was a big fan of Delphus because I liked the way they played when I was a kid. Even in high school, I remember trying to mimic a play of one of their players that was making a move in the game, and I remember going home and trying to mimic that move, that type of thing. But when they were playing twice a year, it was a different kind of a rivalry. It's still a rivalry, especially in some of the older folks. It doesn't have quite the same cachet that it had for years and years, but it's still a big game, and it means a lot to a lot of people.
Well, being that it means a lot to a lot of people, what would it have the same meaning or the same feeling if they took it off of a Sunday?
Probably not. It will never have the feeling that it had, you know, for many decades. I think it's already lost some of it.
Because I was approached a few years ago about taking it off a Sunday because it was a Sunday, and far as scheduling on Friday and Saturdays, you know, moving it to a Tuesday.
Yeah.
I was not the one that was going to touch that, to think about. There's still a lot of old timers and traditionalists that love the tradition. 1 o'clock JV start. Then you got the varsity. It's the only game being played in the state of Ohio.
Right.
I wasn't touching that. You know, being a longtime LCC guy, I had mad respect for it. You know, my father never saw me coach against Delphus St. John's.
Right.
And I was not about to do that because I know the respect and love-hate relationship that Delphus St. John's has with LCC.
Right.
I just think that, like, that would be a wrong move in my heart to do that.
Well, I think you're probably right. You know, that generation that really loved that game, the generation before. I remember my first year, we played them, and that when they had moved the game to Elida Fieldhouse for 4 years, and we beat them, and we weren't supposed to beat them. They were good. We were just getting out of the gate for me, and we pulled that win off. And I remember that night I went home, and I was just it was my first big win. And I just remember how happy I was. And the phone rang off the hook, and it was all these old guys. It was Mulcahy and Williams and Seitz and all these guys that were old St. Rose guys. And they just were, you know, I remember thinking, man, this game means a lot to these people. I remember Skip Davis started crying. And I'm telling my wife, this guy's crying. And so I knew what it meant then to the other generations, and even to Bob, because a week before Bob passed away, I went out to a lunch with him to Land Deck. Some of his players got together, and I went over with a couple guys, and we just sat around and had some beers and chicken, and we were talking. And I sat next to Bob, and I was asking him questions. And I asked him, Bob, what's the toughest loss you ever had in your career? And he thought about it, but while he was thinking about it, everybody else on the table chipped in, and they all agreed it was when his son Jimmy played for him in the 1970s, I think, or early 80s, something like that. And they were number one in the state and undefeated, and they got upset in the first tournament game by St. Mary's, who they had beaten by 30 points like 2 weeks earlier. Jeff Heaston was on that team, and so they agreed that was it. But Bob had never said anything, and then suddenly he leans into me and he goes, and he lost to St. Rose or LCC. And well, I leaned back and I said, I know exactly how you feel, Robert.
I said, could you imagine the Barber, Grodehouse, or Westerns, Jack, could you imagine telling them, hey, we're not playing the T-Birds on Sunday anymore? I think Harry Johnson would lose his mind, that if that happened. Yeah. But I think the game just itself, obviously the rich tradition between both schools, it has, and we want to try to keep that alive, because I feel like the game of basketball with rivalries is kind of dying a little bit because of all the AAU and the kids have relationships outside of the school. So it is losing a little bit of its jazz, but I couldn't do it.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there. I hope it goes on forever. I should mention too, one of my most memorable games at Delphus St. John's was I was sitting on the bench, and at about the middle of the first quarter, a dog walked up to me and started sniffing on me. It was like a German Shepherd or something like that. I looked at, what the hell is this? And here it was the priest there, Father Gorman, had a dog.
Yep.
I used to know, I think his name was Charger or something like that. We used to sit real quietly by him for the games. And I was used to that, but I wasn't used to the dog coming over and asking me for a date. And so That's one of my memories of Delphus.
Well, going to Delphus was always fun, only because I always felt like they'll give you good hugs and good kisses and good lucks, but as soon as you walk by, they're just going to stab you in the back because who you are, being an LCC guy. But that's just a love-hate relationship that both schools have. It's a mutual relationship. And this weekend is the Delphus St. John's LCC game. LCC will be coming over on Sunday. Both teams playing hot. Delphus St. John's undefeated at this point, beating a good Shawnee team. So have you been able to watch the Delphus St. John's play of this year?
I watched them play Van Wert, and Van Wert gave them a good game. But Delphus has just got so much firepower. And they're a great player. The coach's son is the real deal. And he made shots when they needed him the most. But I give Van Wert a great credit for staying in the game with them. But I think they're undefeated, aren't they?
Yeah.
I see them running the table all the way to the end. I mean, I don't see another division. There's 7 divisions now. I don't see another Division 17 that's going to get in their way at all.
Well, you're hurting one of my predictions because I said they're not going to run the table in the MAC because they did it last year, and that's a fantastic feat, and they have the ball club to do it. But they still got to beat a Coldwater, a Versailles, and a Marion Local, who are all 3 very good teams. But like you said, they do have a lot of firepower. But I've been no good in our gambling anyway, so it'd be just another loss for me.
Well, I see they got a good game the other night. Was it from Minster? Somebody played.
Well, they played Minster, and then they played Shawnee this past Saturday, where Cam Elwer hits a 3-pointer to put them up 1 with about 12 seconds left, and that's just Cam for you. I mean, he the night before he gets 41 against Parkway, and then he turns around and plays a really good game against a Shawnee team who was really good and had won 8 in a row at that point. So you love seeing Delphus St. John's, and I've said this between all the Elwer boys that are playing. There's 3 Elwers, two sons and 1 nephew for Aaron that he's getting to coach. It's just a different vibe, and I think you're right. They have something special over there.
Yeah, they've got it going, and LCC's a very young team, probably the youngest team I've ever seen put on a floor at one time. So they're up and down, and to go in that environment is going to be tough for a young team, but. Those games have a way of bringing out the best in both teams.
Well, a lot of times you throw the records aside because on that Sunday, it's a special day.
Right.
Again, we want to thank Coach Seggerson for being our special guest on our bonus Varsity Locker Room podcast. Tune in every week, especially on Spotify and YouTube, to get a breakdown of high school hoops with Frank Kill and Matt Tabler.